So we're going to walk through some of these important security steps. And there's really 4 things that we recommend you do on Ignition Server, and that is to enable SSL. Second is to set up authorization, proper authorization systems. Third is to enable auditing. And fourth is to identify access levels or permissions for who can do what in the application. So let's first start with enabling SSL. And when you go to any browser, any web application in the cloud, if you go log into your bank, whatever it might be, you in your browser will see HTTPS, and you'll see a green check up there that lets you know that you can trust that connection and that you can enter in sensitive data like your passwords or your credit card information or whatever it might be. In fact, your browser makes it very clear if it's not secure, and you shouldn't trust it, and it makes you go through extra steps if you want to get access to it, because there are potential vulnerabilities that exist if you go through untrusted connections. So turning on SSL in Ignition is actually quite simple, and is really something that should be like the first step within the system. And that is what allows it to run on port 443. That's the kind of the default port for HTTPS. You can change that port in Ignition if you'd like, but that is the port that is standard. And then that way, with firewalls, that is what IT departments already lock down. They lock down these servers to only that port, so that the only way into a server is over that secure connection and have that one point of access. So to show you how we can actually enable SSL in Ignition, I'm going to turn it over to Joel to demonstrate that.
Thanks, Travis. So before I switch over to Ignition, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what our goal is here and what the process is to get to our goal. So our end goal is to turn on SSL and TLS in Ignition. We need a certificate trusted by the web browser in order to do that. Web browsers, they trust a certain set of certificate authorities, and so we need to build a certificate signing request and present this to our certificate authority of choice, and then the CA will review our CSR and make us prove ownership of our domain name, and finally generate a certificate chain which we can install into Ignition to turn on SSL and TLS. The certificate chain builds a chain of trust between Ignition's certificate and the root certificate authority trusted by browsers. You can think of a certificate as a driver's license or other type of ID, and the certificate authority as the DMV or the issuer of the ID to kind of get a sense of what these things are. So I'm going to switch over to Ignition now to demo this. So we're going to go to the Ignition config page here and log in. And we're going to go over to the web server page here to configure SSL and TLS. Here's where you set it up. You can see it's not enabled right now, so we're going to fix that. So we go to setup, and in the beginning here, we don't have the certificate chain from the certificate authority, so we need to generate a certificate signing request, and Ignition will help us do that. So we'll say here, I don't have the items above, and then we have to fill out a few required fields in order to generate the request for the certificate. So the first thing is the common name, and the common name is typically the domain name where Ignition is installed. So in our case, we have secure.ia.io. So we're going to go ahead and put that in the common name. We'll take away the protocol there, so it's just the name. The organization name, that's typically your company name. So I'm going to put IA for now. This is usually the department, under your company. So I'll just put software engineering. And then the only other required field here is country. So I'm going to put just US here. And then I'm leaving everything kind of default. We have pretty secure defaults in here. So we have more details on these settings if you want to do some advanced configuration in our documentation. But down here at the subject alternative names, we need to put the IP address that our domain name maps to, as well as sort of copy our domain name again under the DNS name. So what we do here is I'll put that DNS name here and hit add, and that adds it here. And then our IP address we have as well. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that and place that here. Hit add. So now you can see we have those added. If you have additional IP addresses or domain names that could be used to access your Ignition installation, and you want the certificate authority to sort of sign off on all of those, then you can enter additional ones here. For now, this is all we have, so I'm just going to hit Generate Certificate Signing Request. And you'll notice that you have a file here, the CSR file that was downloaded from your browser. And so this is a step where you go to your certificate authority, you take that file, and every certificate authority sort of varies in their process and what they require to prove ownership of your domain. So that's sort of out of scope for this demo. I just wanted to show you that first step. And then now we're going to show you the steps that you take once you have the certificate chain from your certificate authority, after they've vetted the process or the request, and they've given you that chain. This is where we sort of upload this and install it into Ignition to turn on SSL and TLS. So this time we say, I have all the items. The private key that was part of the certificate signing request is already installed in Ignition, and it's safely stored there. So you don't have to worry about that. We just need to upload our certificate chain. So we start with the server certificate. I'm going to drag and drop that into this area. Ignition sort of validates that it matches up with the private key, and it does, so that's good. We then have an intermediary certificate, and then finally the certificate authorities certificate there. And so this is your chain of trust, starting with the server certificate signed off by an intermediary, which is then signed off by the trusted root certificate that browsers trust. And so we'll hit continue. And now you can see that SSL and TLS is enabled. You can see in the browser now we have the lock there, which indicates that the connection is secure. You can see the certificate chain here. In our case, we used Let's Encrypt as our certificate authority. And so now it is secured. And the other thing I will show is there's some settings down here where you can set, the ports for HTTPS. So this is the standard 443 that Travis was mentioning. But right here is this Force Secure Redirect checkbox. I'm going to go ahead and enable that, because what that does is if somebody were to try to access Ignition over just the plain HTTP port 80, which is not secured, Ignition will just redirect that person to the secure HTTPS 443 port. So that way you can ensure that all traffic is going to the secure port. So I'll hit save there. And now that's all set up. So I think we're all good with our secure communications. And back to you, Travis.
All right. Well, thank you for that demonstration. One couple important things to note with that is that one step in secures the entire Ignition server. So any connections into that server, whether that is a prospective session, that's the one access there, or the gateway interface that we have directly for the configuration, or the designer, of course, that gets access, or even, of course, Vision clients, all of the connections to that server are going to be secured and encrypted. So it's just one step to put in place that really can protect you. Now, you mentioned in that, Joel, about the CSR taking it to a certificate authority. I just want to mention that there are certificate authorities that you can purchase, from that he was mentioning, and a lot of industrial organizations, their IT teams and their for Active Directory are their own certificate authority, and we can bring that to those teams, and they can generate those certificates that we can bring on. So they add themselves in your network. They add themselves as a trusted authority to so browsers know that they're good, and they're the ones that want to be responsible for managing all those certificates. So just a couple of things to look at there. It's kind of where you want to get it, and but it's a really important step, as you can see, very, very simple to set up on that. The second part is setting up authorization. And so this is, now we've got the server encrypted. We've got to figure out who is going to be accessing the system. How are they going to be logging in to Ignition? And there's two different kinds of users in Ignition. We have people that are accessing the configuration environment, so that's our web interface, as well as the designer so they can make changes or they can maintain the system. And typically that is only for a very small select few of people or maybe vendors who are actually doing that. And you want to protect that probably separately in terms of who can access. Then, of course, the applications that you're putting in place. So that's the other kind, or the projects you're building, you're going to allow people to log into that. And you are in complete control of what authentication systems you want to use and how you want to lock those down. But one of the great parts about Ignition 8 with Perspective is that we have now the ability to use federated identity providers. And these are providers that provide a single source of truth for the users. It's one place. And so this is where we're all used to Active Directory. Active Directory was a great way of having a single source, and all of our computers, applications can use LDAP to query into that. And that's a great way. But now a more modern approach is to use a federated identity provider. And Microsoft has ADFS. There is Okta, Duo, and many others. And chances are your organization already has one of these providers in place for all of the business applications that you have. So if you're accessing maybe your Google or your Gmail account within the organization, or accessing some other systems, they would want all the authentication to go through one system. So there's a single source of truth, and it provides single sign-on as well. So you can log in one place and have that and access any application in your organization. It's a very very important thing and very secure thing to have set up, because it does also provide two-factor authentication. And that is that it requires two forms to verify the user's identity. One is, of course, the username and password to get access. And the second would be sending a push notification to their phone that they have to accept, or a PIN that was emailed to them, or sends a text message that they can enter in that PIN to be able to gain access. Or in some cases, an UBI key or something they have to plug in that provides that second form. And in all these cases, that having two forms gives us a much better peace of mind that we know who is getting access to the system, and we can lock things down appropriately based on that. The days of having a shared account or something like admin or operator, that needs to go away. We need to have every single user have their own authentication so that we can know who's getting access, and we can lock it down appropriately, and we can also see over, if we look back in history, who did what. And it's very important for everybody to have theirs. And this is a really easy step to make that happen. And, we're used to this in our personal lives where we, can use Facebook to log into other websites. That is a federated identity system. And, you can also piggyback on some of those systems within Ignition, but it just makes it very, very simple to get access. And the simpler we can make it means that users will actually log in as themselves. And so it's a really important step here. And right now, our federated identity providers only works for Perspective, but we are in the process of bringing that back to the rest of Ignition so that we can have it with the designer face or vision as well. But to show you how to set up federated identity providers, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Joel.
Thanks, Travis. Go to the identity providers area here within the config page. And we're going to go ahead and create a new identity provider. And so Ignition supports three types. There's the Ignition type of identity provider, which is sort of just a loop back into Ignition itself and its user sources as a way of authenticating. So it's kind of an internal identity provider. We have two main well-known standards that we implement. So there's OpenID Connect and SAML. We're going to go with OpenID Connect. And so the identity provider we're using today is Okta. So I'm going to give our identity provider name of Okta here. And then there's a bunch of configuration here below, sort of technical details here that can be automatically filled out for you, other than your credentials here to connect to Okta. So the way we can speed this up is we just provide a metadata URL here pointing to your Okta account, and once you hit import, it'll actually fill all that stuff out for you. So let me demo that. Let me grab the URL here, and then we'll hit import. And you can see it was successful, and here's all the details that it filled out, so you don't even have to worry about that. The only two important details you need to add are the client ID and the client secret. which is sort of like the username and the password for Ignition as a client to Okta. So I'm going to go ahead and fill out those details now. And you get this information typically when you register with Okta. They'll provide these details for you in your Okta account. So there we go, filled that out, and we're good to go. So we'll hit save, and it's been created. So we can do a quick test. This is a nice feature we added here so that you can verify that the connection to Okta actually works. So we'll hit test login, and you can see it redirected us to Okta's website. So I'm going to go ahead and log in as one of our users in Okta. And this is the two-factor authentication step that we've configured in Okta. So this is how we do 2FA. And so in this case, we have a push notification set up, and the user is configured to push to Travis's phone. And so Travis has to actually accept the login from his phone in order for us to log into Ignition. So let's go ahead and send the push to his phone.
And you can't see this part, but it just gave me a notification. I'm going to say, yep, you just try to log in. Yep, that's me. And so I accepted that, and it should allow us to get in.
And there we are. We're in. So this is some technical information as you're doing any debugging that you need to do with the connection to Okta. This is OpenID Connect response information. But over here you can see the mapped user information. So you can configure the identity provider to get the first name, last name, and other details from the identity provider, as well as any security levels that were granted to the user. So with that, I think I'll pass it back over to Travis for the next demo.
All right. Well, thank you, Joel. So as you can see, turning on the identity provider is quite simple and is powerful, especially working with Perspective, because you can leverage that single sign-on and leverage that provider that your entire organization is already using for all the other applications that are there. And so once we have, here we've showed SSL is to encrypt the server, the connections to the server. We then have a proper authorization system where we at least thought about how we're going to activate or how we're going to, log into the system. The third is to make sure that we are auditing what people are doing in the system. And this is one that often gets neglected. It's a really simple thing to set up in Ignition and is a built-in feature that we can turn on, and we audit all of the important auditable type of actions. So from people attempting to log in, whether they're successful or unsuccessful, if they're logging out, if they're writing to tags or writing to databases, or executing reports, or if they're in the designer phase and they're saving their projects, or they're publishing things, or if they're modifying tags, or if they're doing anything on the gateway, any gateway scope action that needs to be audited. So there's a lot of auditing, and we've recently increased or have added a lot more functions or features to the auditing system in Ignition 8, starting with 8.07 going forward. And it's like I said, easy to turn on. So to demonstrate that, I want to give you a sense of how you can go from scratch, how you can get that working. I'm going to come back here to our gateway interface. And on this server, under security, there's a bunch of security-related settings. We talked about the identity providers already there, and you can see there's auditing here. And so this is where we can create an audit profile. And I'm going to go ahead and do that, create a new profile. And our profile will store all of the audit events in an external SQL database of your choice. So you can do MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, Postgres, whatever database you'd like. And ahead of time, I already created a connection to a MySQL database. So it's a blank database in there. Once we create this provider or this profile, it'll automatically create the table for us and start logging the events. So I'm just going to go ahead and go next. I'm going to call it audit, go into that MySQL database, and this is the table that we're going to create for you automatically. Go ahead and create the profile, and that's it. Now you've got the profile ready to go. And there's two important places in Ignition where you need to set up the use of that profile. And the first is on the gateway. So under gateway settings, there's the gateway scoped actions that we need to set up. And for that, all we got to do is simply put in the name of that profile here under the gateway audit profile. And so I actually have that in already ahead of time. But you just type that name in, press save, and now all the gateway scoped things will get logged automatically for us. And that's the first place. The second place is within the projects that we're building. And with this, I already had a project created ahead of time called Demo. And we can actually go in and attach auditing to this project or to all of our projects that we have and use that same profile. And we do that in the actual designer. So let's go into our designer launcher. And now that Joel set up the HTTPS on the server, I can actually use my designer launcher to go to this, over the secure port there. So launching this, the communication to that server will be encrypted, which is great. So now I can go ahead and log in. Go into the demo project that we had. And with that, I go up here to our project properties, and simply under the general, I can enable auditing. I can select the audit profile, and now that project is ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and save it. And in fact, anything we do will now be audited. So just by doing that, if I go look real quickly at my database, as a little query browser we provide inside of Ignition, I can see the audit events table. And in fact, there's going to be a couple of rows already in there because I did a project update. I modified the global properties there for this project. So anything that we do from this point forward will automatically get audited. So let's just say that I'm in the designer and I actually want to write to a tag. Let's go over here and write to writable boolean 2. That got audited. You can see it just popped into the audit profile. Now, of course, not only in the designer, but if I'm in the application, all those events are getting audited as well. So a very important step, and we provide those information to you, and you can easily then go back and have that accountability. But it's important that we know who that user is. If we have a shared account, then it's really hard to understand who did what and where they did it. But if I have the actual users authenticating individually, we can then trace it back to exactly what they're doing individually, or if we had some issue, we can see if it was something that somebody did inside of Ignition or if it was external to Ignition. So auditing is a really crucial step. As you can see, pretty easy to get going. Once we do that, we do need to identify who access levels and permissions for who's allowed to do what inside of Ignition. It's really important to understand how people are interacting with the system and where they're getting access to Ignition from. Are they doing it from the HMI that's on the plant floor? Are they doing it from their PC in their office? Are they doing it on their mobile device? Are they doing it at home through a VPN connection or on the road? We need to kind of think about that. With Ignition being server-based and unlimited licensing, it's really easy to get the access out there. And with the authorization we put in place, we have people that can log in. We have to know who is logging in, and so that we can lock it down properly. And that's really about identifying access levels or these levels that you can allow or disallow for various actions. Another thing to consider with Perspective is that there's now a true public mode, meaning that we can actually get into an application, a project, without having to authenticate. It can just be anonymous, public. And the reason for that is there's some data you want to have on TV displays or others where you show some read-only information and you don't want anybody to have to log in. You want to be able to just easily open it up. But then when you have actions or things that require these access permissions, you need to authenticate at that point so we can then know who that person is and we can lock it down based on the roles that they are assigned to, what groups they're in, or what zone they happen to do it from, meaning where they're at within Ignition. And so it is something that is pretty easy, again, to set up inside of Ignition, and I want to give you a sense of how this works. So let's go back to this application. Now, we built that demo project ahead of time, and so I'm going to go and launch that project as a client. And you'll notice right away that when I launch it, it is set to use the public mode. So I'm actually right into the application right here. I didn't have to log in. Of course, it's encrypted and secured to the server, but I didn't have to log in. So that means that anything I put into Ignition that is in public mode is available. And you definitely don't want to do anything where you're writing the tags or exposing sensitive data. You want to protect that as much as possible. But here I have some actions. I have this unsecured button that I could certainly press. Oh, great. But then I have secured buttons and screens that are not accessible. So if I look at that, I get an access denied on the secured button. If I go to the control or audit log screens, I get access denied here. So that is because we have set up the permissions inside this project to respect that. And I'll kind of show you where these things are. But before we really do that, we have to identify those security levels and or those roles and zones that are allowed to do different things. So if I go back to the configuration, we have within our identity provider, you can bring back, when the user authenticates, you can bring back the set of roles that a user has. So I can then know right from there what they're allowed to do. You can also then identify security zones within Ignition, where there are lists of IP addresses or host names where we can restrict, people based on where they're located. So you can use a combination of roles and zones to qualify what that person's allowed to do. And with Perspective, we do it through security levels. It's kind of a way of abstracting that into, you define the levels that you want, and then we can qualify those levels behind the scenes based on some, various rules to determine if they are allowed to do, to be in that level or not. So what we did ahead of time is here, we created an operator level that is under the authenticated. So they have to be authenticated, and they would have this operator role in certain situations. So we just define the levels, and then on our identity provider, that's where we can actually go in for the Okta one. We can easily grant certain levels to individual users if you want to do it manually, or you can define rules that would allow it to automatically, based on when it logs in, or run that rule to see does it qualify or not. And so in my particular case, I'm going to do a pretty simple rule here where I can just see if it's that particular user ID. But you can look at the roles that came back from the identity provider. You can look at the zones. There are special functions we have, and if you look at the documentation, you can use ands and ors and all sorts of things to verify what that person is. Plus, there can be other attributes that come back from the IDP, the federated provider, that we can use in here as well. So we just simply put that rule in place, and now when I authenticate, I would know whether I have the operator level or not. And so I'm going to come back here. So again, I've locked this button and these two views to that. And we simply do that by, in the designer, we're using those levels on our actions and our views within Perspective. So I'm going to go first and foremost, open up the view that had those two buttons. And so here is the secured button. If I look at it, look at the events that we've got configured, this main one, look at the security settings, it is set to use that operator level that we identified. So they have to have that in order to run that event. And that's all checked on the server. There's no way that a person in the browser could do this action without going through this authorization on the server side, because there's no way for them to poke that into the server. It's only just saying, hey, I want to run this. Here's the event that I want to run. The server determines whether it can do it or not. And that's what makes Perspective so much intrinsically secure from the beginning. So that was on the button there. The second piece is on the actual view themselves. So if I look at this control view or the audit view, any of these views, I can see that there's a little shield right here. So if that means there's security configured, permissions, it's also locked down to the operator. And so then if I go back to the application, that's where, again, I get that access denied because I'm not logged in at this point and I can't view these particular views. So let's go ahead and sign in. We're going to go through that same process of Okta. I'm going to send that push. So then I just got it on my phone. I'm going to say, yep, that's me. It's going to come back. We now know that I am logged in to the system. So Travis is now logged in. And I have that role, so that level. So I should be able to click on that secure button, and now I should also be able to see these other two screens. And so if I look at the audit log that we set up previously, I can see all the audit events that have happened so far, that they've been able to log in, that we did those changes in the designer, all of that. And so further, if I do any actions like writing to a tag, let's go here to the control and turn this machine status off, change this set point here to say 30, those are now audited. And so if I look at the audit profile, I can see that this user did that right to those particular tags with those values. And there's other information behind the scenes as to where they did it from as well. We get all of that data. So, it's really important to kind of identify these levels, figure out who's accessing the system and from where, so that we can properly set that up inside of Ignition. And so these 4 steps that we took, that we showed here today, are 4 important necessary steps to really secure Ignition in your environment. And it's something that shouldn't be thought of way down the road. It should be thought of at the beginning. And setting them up early so that we give it the best chance. The worlds of OT and IT are colliding. We have to make sure we're putting our best foot forward in securing our system. Now, we're just software, of course. There's a lot of other things to secure in the OT side of the fence. But we got to think about every connection point and every place that these things happen. And So it's just a kind of hopefully will illustrate that.